And Sandra, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Megan, and let me welcome you to our webinar today. Our topic is going to be science-based targets initiatives in your manufacturing company. And my name is Randy Green. I'll do a brief introduction and I'll introduce our presenter in a few slides, but Sandra and Ciso will be presenting to us today. So this webinar is part of our P2 program in the Partnership for Sustainable Georgia. We partner here in the state of Georgia with the Green Chamber of the South, Oglethorpe Power, and the U.S. EPA to promote and assist organizations with pollution prevention. P2 is a program for reducing pollution at the source. Go to the next slide for us. Yeah, so our whole focus is really on not just efficiently relocating or recycling waste, but trying to figure out how to reduce waste at the source, to eliminate it. And then we don't need the other programs to manage and process waste, whether it's in a landfill or for recycling or whatever. But this is, I think, started in the early 90s with EPA, and Georgia Tech's been a partner with EPA for many years in this program. And we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and see more and hear more about this topic. If you are a manufacturer in the state of Georgia, we would love to talk with you about how we could help reduce pollution from your facility and make you more efficient and sustainable. Go to the next slide, please. Well, I will say as we leave that slide, there is a link there for you to go see more about it. So our group at Georgia Tech is the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. You see a great looking group of people in that picture who are really dedicated and focused on improving manufacturing within the state. We do have some federal sponsorship, but we also get support from the state. And we partner with the manufacturing companies we serve to reduce cost and improve their overall performance, not just financially, but that's certainly one outcome that we seek, but to strengthen the manufacturing that's done in the state of Georgia so we're competitive in a global economy, because it's not just about competing with the company next door. Our manufacturers compete with, organizations all over the globe. And that's a very deep team of expertise that we have in the MEP. And we would certainly appreciate the chance to work with you. Next slide, please. So we are distributed across the state. There are regional offices. If you find yourself in one of these areas, there's a resource close to you. So Georgia Tech is in Atlanta, but we recognize that that's not convenient to all the manufacturing that goes on. There's a lot of manufacturing in these other regions. You see how we've divided up the state and where your regional office is. You can read more details about that if you'll scan the QR code, and you can find the contact in your part of the state. And again, we invite you to reach out to us if there's anything we can do, or you have any interest or concerns, or you come across any topic that you think Georgia Tech might be part of the solution for. Even if we don't have the resource in MEP, we will try and connect you with the resources, whether that's inside Georgia Tech, another university, or we work with other experts in many disciplines across all the topics relevant to manufacturing. Next slide, please. So we work in a lot of areas. Sustainability is one that certainly has maybe an increased emphasis more recently, but we try to help organizations think about managing at the top of the organization, how to set the right strategy and develop leadership, but also as you move into the factory floor, process improvement, quality management, and on the sustainability front, we do a lot of work with manufacturers in the area of energy management and trying to improve energy efficiency, and the other topics related to sustainability, like environmental compliance would be one, but also working with ISO 14001 and environmental management systems. We also support, you see the list on the other side of that screen, in cybersecurity and technology implementation are newer practice areas for it, but they're quite relevant and certainly of interest to manufacturers today, because as I said, we are competing in a global economy for business, but we're also operating in a global environment where security and other risks are important considerations, even for manufacturers that don't seem to be in, you don't have to be in a big city to be a target for, you know, the folks who are trying to take advantage of the connected environment that we have in today's businesses. Next slide, please. So here's just a brief recap of our results. We worked with over 500 manufacturers in the last year. We're involved in projects that help to create 1,600 jobs and retain or increase sales of almost 500 million. We've helped to reduce operating costs and help organizations with projects that led to capital investment, all of which, you know, strengthens that profile for the state of Georgia as a manufacturing force in the global economy. Next slide, please. And today's our speaker is Ms. Sandra Enciso. She comes to us, well, I should say she's been with Georgia Tech for 10 years now. And before that, she served for 15 years working in academia, manufacturing, and consulting. She has received a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and has a master's in environmental resource management, which she received in 2005. She's an expert in environmental compliance and environmental management systems. She provides sustainability services to manufacturers and is also proficient and works with manufacturers in helping with their energy management systems as well, both ISO 14001 and ISO 50001. She does also support manufacturers in integrating their health and safety systems, quite often with their environmental systems, but she's an expert in ISO 45001. She's a certified lead auditor for ISO 14001, and currently she is completing her GRI certification, which will happen soon. GRI is a scheme for, you know, environmental reporting, and comes to today quite proficient in the topic that we're going to listen to. So, Sandra, we appreciate your time and dedication in putting this together for us today. So I'll turn it over to you to let's hear more about science-based targets.
Thank you, Randy. Welcome, everyone. Today, I will be talking about science-based targets initiatives and how these might affect or what type of impacts they may have in your organizations. It seems like it become a trending topic in the past 10 years or so. So I would like to start by understanding and defining what SBTs are, its importance in this new global economy, and the perception that a lot of organizations have that join this initiative. Then we'll be talking about the relationship between your existing key performance indicators or existing environmental goals or targets that your organization might have, and these SBTs and how they compare to each other, and the consequences and the impacts that SBTs might have within your business. When we think about and talk about science-based targets, we mainly refer to those targets related to greenhouse gas emissions and targets to reduce these emissions into the atmosphere. So we'll be looking into common strategies and best practices that organizations have been using and used during this time to evaluate the greenhouse gases. And then we'll have some time for questions and comments. But before I start with the SBTs, I would like to take a few minutes to go back in time to some events and also define and make sure that we are all in the same page when it comes to certain terms and concepts that are important in understanding SBTs and their implications for our businesses. So for those of you my age or below might remember that back in 2015 in Paris, there was a conference of interested parties and different countries and organizations to talk about the future of the global warming and climate change effects that industries have posed and our new lifestyles present in current times. So the Paris Agreement was a legally binding international treaty on climate change that was adopted by the COP21 with the main goal in mind to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. The target and the preference is to lower to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial greenhouse gas emission levels. So with that in mind, and given the climate science that was discussed and agreed upon during this conference at this meeting, there was a need to create a decarbonization process for industries and regions and countries around the world. So the net zero standard was created. So by definition, net zero is the overall balance between emitting and absorbing carbon in the atmosphere. The outcome of limiting catastrophic climate change requires companies and countries to become net zero. What this means is that by 2015, most organizations must be close to zero emissions for carbon or any of these 6 greenhouse gases that have been identified, and have the proper mechanisms in place or strategies to neutralize the greenhouse gas emissions that cannot be eliminated. So in planning and setting this goal and this path, the organizations agreed, and countries and different agencies and governments understand the need for a transition plan. So back in 2020, the same COP21 consortium realized that they wanted to set a goal to reduce greenhouse gases emissions by 2030 by reducing them 50% or having them, and eventually reach to net zero emissions by 2050. With this in mind, the organization to provide assurance that there was a transparency and consistency and a reliability process to measure, identify, and report these greenhouse gases, was presented by creating the CDP that used to be known as a Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a not-for-profit entity and organization that runs the global reporting system for investors, companies, cities, stakeholders, and organizations or corporations to assess their environmental impacts. The world's economy looked to CDP as the gold standard for environmental reporting activities. Today, the CDP reporting scheme and standard presents us with the richest database and data set ever existed for environmental impact and environmental reporting across the world. So every organization that have adopted, and even if they don't adopt this initiative, but have some sort of responsibility to report greenhouse gases, is included in this database or this data set. It's the most comprehensive, and all corporates and governments look into this action that have been taken according to the CDP. So having said that, SBTs is a partnership between these 5 different entities: CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, or WRI, and the WWF organization, with the We Mean Business Corporation Consortium, which is part of the Kyoto Protocol. So SBTs is a globally entity and organization that promotes and encourages businesses to set ambitious greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets that align with the latest climate science as defined and established during the Paris Agreement. The SBT's goal is to mobilize companies across the world to support a global economy that is based and more looking forward to low carbon economies and low carbon way of doing business and a more sustainable development. SBTs defines and promotes best practices in setting science-based targets, offers resources and guidance to reduce actual or potential barriers for its adoption, and independently assess or evaluates the companies that join this initiative and submit targets to reduce greenhouse gases. So more information about this can be found at their cdp.net website. There is a lot of interest in provide organizations with best tools available for the adoption of these initiatives. In other words, SBT is the entity that assure and provide a transparency process for interested parties or other stakeholders to trust and make decisions towards organizations and the impact that a lot of companies or different type of entities present or might have as part of their business practices and activities. So by definition, science-based targets provide a clearly defined pathway for companies and financial institutes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as we said before, that align with the Paris Agreement criteria. But in reality, what BTs provides to the public and the entities is a way to validate and verify that these targets or performance indicators are adequate and can really tell the story on the efforts and initiative that companies take to minimize and lesser their environmental footprint. Something that I found interesting in understanding and reviewing the statistics of SBTs and in their, not only in the CDP website, but also the SBT website, is that ever since the creation of this initiative back in 2015, there were only 200 organizations or companies that joined voluntarily into these efforts. Later, back in 2019, there were only 400 organizations that have expressed their commitment to join the initiative. Today, if you go into their website, you could see that after 2019 up to November 2022, there are more than 4,200 companies that have committed to the initiative. So I think that's a really interesting, the way that the adoption of the SBTs have happened in the last 2 years is exponentially admirable. Out of those over 4,000 companies, 586 organizations are US-based or United States. And I'm talking about 100% American organization. This is not organizations that have parent companies overseas, whether it's in Asia or Europe. These are United States-based companies. While it's still a low ratio, I think it's still encouraging to see how the adoption and the commitment to the initiative has grown in such a short amount of time. Out of those 4,000 over 4,200 organizations, 2,080 have received approval on these SBTs. What that means is that after a company submit their intentions and their commitment to join the initiative, it has a period of time to develop and present the CDP and the consortium and the agreement with targets that can be verified, and then later on needs to be sustained and demonstrate their achievement. Out of the 2,000 organizations that have approved SBTs, 282 are also United States-based organizations. This approval process takes place with third-party organizations and entities that provide technical advisory groups and expertise to companies in determining and selecting the best targets that will fulfill the criteria as established by the partnership on the SBTs. But then looking more into the statistics, we find that over 1,500 organizations have net zero commitments, and 282 of those organizations are also from United States. So let's say and think about your organization and under your current position, where you've been told that the company has adopted or has decided to join the initiative on SBTs, what that really entails for you as an EHS professional, and what that's the repercussions or the effect that it might have in your company, in your organization. So to be part of the SBT, there is a 5-step process. SBT call it as a call for an action. CDP and the consortium and this partnership call it an action plan. So you can see here the 5 steps that a company must undertake to become an SBT certified. So the first step is, as I said before, is an intention and declarations of the organization to commit to this initiative. It's a very simple process. Companies go under the CDP website, download the letter of commitment complete the form and send it. From that initial date, companies have 24 months or 2 years to develop a target. Once the target is developed, and for that, CDP and SBTs have a lot of resources in their website that are free and available to any type of organization, regardless of the sector and their sizes or the industry type, that are that provide guidelines and the basis for identifying and setting these targets. So you follow their SBTs criteria and make sure that it's in alignment or follows the target validation protocol. Depending on the type of sector or the type of target, there is a protocol, and you just need to make sure that it's specified when you submit the application. So once you have working your target, you make the submission, and in doing so, there is a set of path that you can take in submitting these targets. So there are 3 types of targets, timeframes, or characteristics defined as near-term, long-term, and net zero targets. The near-term targets are designed to fulfill and leverage the first intentions to having greenhouse gases emissions by 2030. So these are typically targets between 5 to 10 years. The criteria and the reduction ranges may vary between 50% to 80, 90%. The long-term targets, on the other hand, are targets that aim to fulfill the reduction or decarbonization goals on their SDGs and the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals and the SBTs initiative. And these have to be met by 2050 or before 2050 by 2040 if you are part of the petrochemical oil organizations or business sector. So these are more long-term and more stringent goals. The criteria used or allowed up to October of 2022 is to set this target either between 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. So organizations were allowed to choose based on the science and based on their own measurements and monitoring programs to set which criteria they can achieve. And this was, as I said, up to October of this year. After 2022, for all these targets, near-term or long-term targets, the criteria is 1.5 degrees Celsius. There is not an option to select 2 degrees Celsius anymore. Now, zero targets, net zero targets, is the combination, include both near-term targets and long-term targets. But the targets for long-term and net zero targets start at least at 95% reduction of greenhouse gases at a minimum of CO2, carbon dioxide equivalent, and methane. But the intent of the SBTs is that organizations commit and develop targets that addresses and manage the 7 GHG gases emissions that exist. But up to today, it's still the expectation is to submit targets related to CO2 or methane. Once the targets are approved and you make the submission and this scheme of entities and organizations that partner with CDP and the SBTs, known as technical advisory groups, work with you and validate and set these targets, you are ready to communicate. So SBT's website will present the companies and the efforts and the action plans that these organizations have taken to report these targets. And from that moment, this information become available to the public. And the fifth, last but not least step, the disclosure, they'll disclose after communication is being performed and complete. Companies are required to report on annual basis their emissions regarding greenhouse gases and these targets. Your TAGs will work with you and guide you through the process of reporting, or if you ever find yourself as an entity and organization in a situation where your operating conditions or changes in your industry sector prevent you from achieving or stay on track with the targets, modifications to these targets can be done, and it will be performed at that moment with the assistance of the CDP and the tag groups. So with that said, oftentimes when we work with organizations and especially manufacturing, we get the question, how is that our existing environmental goals or targets or KPIs that we have set in attempt to achieve these goals align or connect with SBTs, or how these SBTs are different from what we are doing at the moment? So setting targets, it's a business practice. Organizations develop and set these targets to ensure that a specific topic, subject, or an issue is under the radar of leadership or senior management teams, so they can make informed decisions towards the sustainability and the stability of their business, right? In fact, most strategic business plans require companies to identify or to set some type of indicators related to aspects that are relevant and essential to the business, like revenue, sales, production, and any other type of key business indicators. So performance towards these targets can be evaluated and assessed and demonstrated to others, such as clients and stakeholders that have certain expectations or requirements on our products and performance, right? So it is very rare for companies not to have some type of environmental or energy management system in place that already gave them the tools and the framework to identify and set targets that help them to lower their environmental impacts or achieve, improve certain performance regarding environmental performance or energy performance related to energy use or consumption, or water consumption, or waste generation. So they are already monitoring and measuring activities that companies are taking, right? It is accepted and it's okay by SBTs and CDP to evaluate these KPIs. And if your current practices and the processes that you have in place to monitor and measure your energy and environmental performance align with the criteria, they can be validated by the different technical advisory groups that I was mentioned before. So if that's the case, once your KPIs are approved by these entities, you just need to follow the series of steps related to communicating this as part of your sustainability index report, or as part of your stakeholders and maybe other type of liabilities or responsibility that you might have with others, right? and report on annual basis the results and the status of these targets to the public. But after submitting your KPIs, these KPIs lack maybe more science behind the way that these indicators were identified or how they were established, or the monitoring activities or practices that you have in place don't look into variables or factors that are probably more relevant into defining this performance. These technical committees or groups will guide you and help you through the process, and will give you the tools needed to implement and monitor and strengthen these measurements. So existing KPIs can be submitted for validation under SBTs, and it's okay to use your existing programs to align and join the initiative and enhance your value proposition or your reputation and the branding of your company. I want to share with you what CDP declares to be a philosophy, right? You can manage what you don't measure. Oftentimes, organizations measure factors, measure activities, measure emissions for many reasons. And when in the Paris Agreement and under the climate change agreement back in 2015, this transition plan and these metrics were set, there was a intention to understand that managing and setting these high expectations and the ambitions to reduce or maintain the rising temperatures in atmosphere by lower to 1.5 degrees Celsius will present challenges and issues for a lot of organizations. And the best way to manage these targets that maybe were set by others within your company, and you are assigned with the responsibility to deploy and achieve these targets, is to identify and look what is that your measure and how you can measure these things maybe more effectively and more meaningful for your program, right? So on the SBT website, there you can find there is a tab and a huge area where you can find resources. And I strongly recommend you are new in this system, in this process, to spend some time browsing around and becoming familiar with the expectations and what the criteria is, and how this criteria aligns or define your performance, your environmental performance, and the expected or your ambitions in reducing the greenhouse emissions that your business might generate. So here are some links for you to check. So as I said, the SBT criteria is well established and defined to be 1.5 degrees Celsius. The how-to guide will help you to set the boundaries and understand your business context and identify those key stakeholders and other parameters that play a key role when managing risks and looking for opportunities to set these science-based targets for reduction, significant reductions in emissions. The net zero standard criteria is also, they are available to everyone, that explains the decarbonization process and the expectations for a low economy in the next 20 years to lesser the repercussions of a severe changes in climate. And last but not least, the protocol used by SBTs when reporting and measuring and identifying the greenhouse gases. So I really like to recommend you to browse that website and find the data and the information that might help you not only to deploy these overarching goals that oftentimes are set by corporate or maybe as a request by customers or external stakeholders that we need to manage internally with resources that are available. So when we think about organizations that need to report greenhouse gases or need to identify or develop an inventory process for these emissions, in our experience working with the region and manufacturing companies, there is not really a clear path to know if your company has and what type of greenhouse gases has, right? So in my experience, most organizations that report greenhouse gases is because it was established or identified as part of some compliance obligation program, some type of environmental regulation that requires them to measure and report GHGs, right? So if you are a company here in Georgia with PSDs, or if you have a Title V operating permit program, you most likely have to measure and track and monitor your greenhouse gases. And they are thresholds already established for you. One of the downfalls of regulations is the labor intense and the time consuming that these processes can be. On the other hand, regulations also present you with or provide you with the tools and the criteria and the processes that help you to perform these monitoring activities in a consistent manner. So effluent limits, emission parameters are set for yourself, for the companies. Periodicity or frequency of monitoring and checking are already established by the regulations. So oftentimes, if you are regulated, you have any of these two permits or these two permits, you know that you have greenhouse gases. But that's not always the case. Some organizations don't know how to start evaluating or looking into greenhouse gases if it wasn't because there is an external driver for it. So corporate have the initiative, or organizations have joined the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, and as part of that commitment, they are now in the path to report greenhouse gases. And now you are a site located miles, 100,000 miles away from corporate, having to look for the generation of these emissions, right? Where they are, what they are, and how to track them, or what are the tools that you have in place to check on that. So along with that, it might be also a request by a customer or by a specific consortium that your industry is participating in. So here are the three main and ways that companies identify and find themselves having to report on greenhouse gases. And if we go to talk about more in detail how these emissions are classified, so as a lot of you might know, they are divided in three different scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2, and 3. Scope 1 is the emissions, the direct emissions generated at your site, whatever is in your boundaries, whatever is generated at a defined source, a point source. Scope 2 are the emissions from indirect activities or are also including the purchase energy or any outsourced service provider that you might have. If you have an activity, a process for coating or for plating that is essential in your product, but your product exits your facility, gets plated or coated, and then come back to your facility for final production, is that impact, those emissions counts towards your performance level and your targets. Scope 3 goes even beyond these boundaries and these barriers. So it's all emissions from the entire business value chain, from life cycle, from acquisition of raw materials, including suppliers, including the end of the useful life of your products and the activities that your business touch into in the process of producing your products, right? The expectations for these initiatives under SBT is just to report and set targets and join the framework, these protocols with scope 1 and 2. Eventually, the SBT will look into scope 3. It doesn't mean that if you have a scope 3 the targets and measuring and monitoring programs in place, you cannot submit them as well. They will be evaluated if you decide that too. But at a minimum, SBTs will expect you to submit and assess, develop targets for scope 1 and 2. So having said that, and if you are as an entity new in the process, and even if you're not new, but you have other environmental or energy programs in place, and you want to know, okay, what will be the best way for me to join the initiative, start reporting, and becoming more available to the public, right? So to understand this, we like to suggest every time we engage with the company in the process, we develop a roadmap for measuring and monitoring GHGs. And the best is very simple and standard practice to conduct these 3 steps. The first step is to know, identify what is that you are measuring at the moment. I don't know an organization that doesn't have a energy goal or an energy reduction of energy consumption, a target for that, whether it is from year to year or in 5 years or in an estimated amount of time. So use what you have. Don't think that you have to recreate the wheel or that you have to start with ambitious targets when joining this initiative. Investigate where are your what are those waste streams that might contribute to the emission of these gases. Sometimes companies have either biodigesters or digesters around the facilities that might create other greenhouse gas emissions or secondary emissions there. Identify your air emissions. Think about what is that you are at the moment. What are those operations or areas where you have some vents into the atmosphere or into the air? And if you are measuring, what is that you're measuring? What are those metrics that you have in place? What are the indicators? And understanding the energy usage and consumption within your site is a good starting point. And in doing so, it's very common to know that organizations realize that the moment energy crosses their boundaries, it flows and splits within your production lines in different ways. In some ways, it might be heat. In other areas, might be for cooling. In other areas, it could be electricity. In other areas, it could be gas. So understanding and identifying the different energy types also help you to have a big perspective of where your monitoring and measurement programs are. Then look into the sources. Where are these generated, and develop a carbon footprint or CO2 emission process for you to better understand the state, the initial conditions, where you're going to set your baseline and that point of reference when setting targets that are based on this data, the data that you gather, the data that you manage, and the data that you control. So this is typically known as an energy review process. And as part of that, assign or determine some significance when it comes to either operation activities or equipment units that use energy the most. So you have a good kind of layout and footprint of how you're going to manage and start looking for those opportunities and what are the risks related to energy availability or accountability for your revenue and growth expectations for the companies, right? So, and third step is prioritize and identify those significant either waste streams or emission sources that will give you the most amount of reduction or cuts. So your targets are set to address the biggest pollutants or the biggest sources of emissions for greenhouse gases. At Georgia Tech, we use a tool that was developed by our group manager, Randy Green, known as the GT Energy Review Tool. It's a energy balance that allows organizations to, as I said before, identify how energy flows within your manufacturing facilities, and identify where and how you can set specific either target or goals to manage that and reduce either energy consumption and optimize energy use and efficiency. So here, and as part of this tool, there is a calculator for greenhouse gases or in CO2 equivalent. So you can see this is an example for a company that you can see how in terms of CO2 equivalent, 55% of that is generated by the utilities. And when you look further and review the energy across the different operations and practices, the tool also give you a list of sources for the greenhouse gases. So you can see here as an example, it's a list of areas or equipment like boilers, sinter strip processes. This is for a kaolin company. And it calculates the kilograms of CO2 and the percentage and what it means in terms of greenhouse gases. Then as part of identifying opportunities to improve energy efficiency across your organization, this tool will prompt you to consider a set of factors that include, among others, greenhouse gases contribution, opportunities or capacity that the company has to take an action to reduce energy consumption or energy use, other variables related of factors such as environmental impacts and opportunities for adoption of renewable energy sources or mechanisms. So you can also extend these evaluation metrics as pertaining to your existing practices. And for those of you familiar with energy management systems that are based on ISO standards, know that it is part of what the standard provides to you. It's part of the criteria that has to be met to be certified. But something I just want to share and kind of highlight here is that when we think about ISO 50001 or energy management system, oftentimes as an organization, we are focusing on energy savings, right? Opportunities to enhance energy performance, not necessarily to reduce or cut emissions related to greenhouse gases. What SBTs and the main difference between your existing KPIs or existing probably energy goals and targets versus SBTs is that the main focus for SBTs is where are those energy sources for greenhouse gas emissions. So you might take an action, or you might develop a project or energy efficiency to improve energy efficiency, but not necessarily will result in reducing greenhouse gases, okay? So that's something to consider when you said you joined this initiative. So in conclusion, SBTs are a key tool for the low carbon transition in the global economy. And that's the expectation for the next 20, 30 years. SBTs allows organizations to grow in a sustainable manner. These targets based on science allow companies to determine the path that they want to take in selecting them, and they could be absolute targets, they could be absolute numbers that the company is able to measure and report, or they could be, you could choose to go on the path to set targets that are more intensity, or as they call it, sector specific. And when we talk about targets that are based on intensity, we are referring to a ratio. So it will be a level of emissions of these greenhouse gases related or normalized to a variable or a factor that is meaningful for an organization, for your organization, whether it is production, whether it is manpower, hours of work, or is temperature, whatever the case might be, it's a ratio. Both paths, whether you decide to select a target that is an absolute number or an intensity number, has its pros and cons. The benefit of using SBTs is that the entities and these tag groups that work with you will help you accommodate and identify what works best given your measuring and capacities, your technological abilities, and the resources that you have at hand, and eventually following the same philosophy of the Plan, Do, Check, Act, that ISO standards. And for those of you that are not familiar with ISO, it stands for the International Organization for Standardization, will present you. And the more data you get based on science and based on your monitoring programs, the more capacity you will have to control and set more effective targets for you. But SBTs are comparable with your ISO 50001 and 14001 systems or objectives, if you have any of those. And even if you are not certified, but you have existing goals related to reducing your overall environmental footprint, reach out to these groups and they will help you. And as I said, the SBT website have a good guide to identify and set these targets that makes sense and business sense for you. So with that said, I think that my main something I want you to leave, my main question for you and to think about will be what the expectations for your organization regarding the SBT, the Science-Based Target Initiative. And what does it mean to you as an organization? A lot of companies we see lately in the past 5-10 years that it has become a way of growth. If you want to stay in business, you want to grow in a sustainable manner, you have to demonstrate that you are committed to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions or to contribute to this overarching goal to maintain the rising temperatures below or to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, but in reality, in your business plan, how do you see this affecting your organizations and what it means to you to join this network? And as a company, what is the your current ability to fulfill or join and commit the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? What is the path moving forward to grow, achieve your business metric, and be sustainable and in harmony with the planet and the society and the regions where you have business on? So that's something for you to think about it, ask the question to your top management level, to others in the organization, and start working on your monitoring and existing metrics. That's all that I have for today. You have questions, I'm happy to address them. As I said, at Georgia Tech, we have some strategies and tools and ways that we have used to help guide companies to engage and achieve this, join this initiative and help them achieve their sustainability goals for their companies. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Oops.